Shalom? All right. So I'm going to begin with the blessing over the Torah. And when I do that, it's basically preparing our hearts to hear the words of Torah and let it just soak in. It says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah v'ha'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratecha b'finu ufi amecha beit Yisrael v'niyeh anachnu v'tzatzayenu v'tzatzayei amecha beit Yisrael kulanu yodiei shmecha v'lomedei Toratecha lishma Baruch atah Adonai hamalamed Torah La'amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher bechar banu mechol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us through his commandments, and has commanded us to engage in the study of the words of Torah. Please, Lord our God, may the words of your Torah be sweet in the mouths our mouths and the mouths of your people, the house of Israel, so that we, our descendants, and the descendants of your people, the house of Israel, may all know your name and study your Torah for its own sake. Blessed are you, Lord, who teaches Torah to his people, Israel. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has chosen us from all the peoples and given us his Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, giver of the Torah. Amen. So, this week we begin the Torah portion of Pinchas. It is basically Numbers 25, verse 1, 25, verse 11, all the way to chapter 30, verse 1. And for a little context, next slide. In order to get a good picture of what this week's Torah portion is, we need to go back to last week's Torah portion, the portion of Balak. In it, Balak tries to get Balaam to curse the people of Israel. Balaam doesn't curse the people of Israel, he blesses them. And then Balaam and Balak make a plan. And they're like, well, we can't curse these people, so what are we going to do? We're going to get them to sin. So, as a result, the people are led astray. I lost my slide. That's okay. The people are led astray with the Midianite and Moabite women at Baal Peor. One of the leaders, this is very interesting, leads the rebellion. He's a head of the tribe of Simeon. His name is Zimri, and the woman he is with is Cosbi Batsur, a Midianite princess. As a result, 24,000 people die in the plague that results from the rebellion. Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, so he's the grandson of Aaron, the high priest, kills both Zimri and Cosbi with a spear, and the plague is stayed. As we come into this week's Torah portion, we get our name for the Torah portion from Numbers 25, verse 12. Ignore the 2. It should say 12. And it says, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. So basically, this is someone who's standing in the gap for the children of Israel. Next slide. If we look at Phinehas' name, it's very interesting because the Hebrew can be broken down into two words. We look at Pinchas. And the Hebrew, it literally means pi nechash, the mouth of the serpent. The last letter is what I want you all to focus on, because it is crucial here. That is the shin. But in the Hebrew, a shin also looks like a sin. So Pinchas' name should sound like Pi Nachash, Pinchash. But it has the sound of the sin. Pinchas. And if you look at where the dot is on the shin, that affects the sound, making it a shin that gives it a sh sound. But if it's on the other side, it gives it the S sound. And the rabbis, they look at that and they say, that represents a deeper spiritual principle. If you look at your right hand, that represents Abraham, that represents chesed, that represents kindness. If you look at the left hand, that represents Isaac, that represents judgment. So when you take Pinchas's name and you look at Pinchas, and you focus on that last letter, it sounds like judgment. But it does not have a sin at the end of its last name. It actually has a samach. And in studying the Hebrew, you'll find that a lot of times the samach and the sin are replaceable. That means you can take the samach and replace it with the sin. So even though the samach in Pinchas sounds like the sin, which represents judgment, gevura, think of it as representing more like mercy, more like resurrection. In the Jewish Siddur, there's a prayer, the second prayer in the Amidah. It is the prayer of Gibor. It's the prayer of resurrection. And one of the lines in the prayer says, Somech Nofalim. It literally means you support the fallen. So keep that tucked in the back of your mind. Next slide, please. It's kind of interesting because if you move down to the next verse, if we actually stay in the same verse, we notice God establishes his covenant of peace with Pinchas. He says, Lachen emor hineni noten lo et briti shalom. Say, therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship. I like covenant of peace better. And it is important to look at that word, the last word, if I go back up, shalom, focus on that word. Because on a Torah scroll, when you go to look at a synagogue Torah scroll, one that's been copied, and they have strict rules regarding copying of Torah scrolls. So Moses, he gave the first Torah scroll, the next scribe would copy it faithfully. So there are when you see oddities, Yeshua called them jots and tittles, that's saying stop here, there's a deeper spiritual message to glean here. And when you look at the word, give him my covenant of peace, you look at the vav, and this is what it looks like on a Torah scroll. It's broken. Keep that in mind. Next slide, please. The covenant, if you scroll down further, it's a covenant for the priesthood. It's the promise that Pinchas's priesthood would be an eternal one. It says, it shall be for him and his descendants after him a pact of priesthood for all time. Briti kohuna olam, because he took impassioned action for his God and thus made expiation for the Israelites. Next slide, please. And that word expiation actually means atonement. Because we look at Vaykaper el bnei Yisrael. He made atonement over the sons of Israel. Next slide, please. Sorry, guys, about the slides. We were talking earlier, and the tech guys in the back. It's just, with the things going on, I'll need them to be clicking, so just bear with me on that. It says, Pinchas made atonement over the children of Israel. I want you to focus on the tense of this verse, on that verb. That is, he made atonement. It is written in the future tense, and it is also written in the past tense. The vav at the beginning of this word, he made atonement, turns, he will make the atonement past. So, you have yekaper, that is, he will make atonement, and then you have the vav, and that turns it past. So, it expresses a continual action. It happened and it's going to happen. Furthermore, it is imperfect. It is also in the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense in Hebrew denotes it's continuing. It's continuing. Next slide, please. This is what I really like about this verse. Pinchas made atonement over the children of Israel. A good translation of this verse, and if you go to John Parsons' website, Hebrew for Christians, he talks about this verse in detail, and he says, a good translation is, he atones for Israel till the end of all generations. So, next slide. Before we go to there, so just keep that in mind. Think of it. You have Pinchas here, and he atones for Israel for all generations. Is it really talking about Pinchas, or is it talking about someone else? So a quick detour. Think about how many people died in the plague that Pinchas stayed. 24,000 people died. The sages say that Eve, when she was brought to Adam, was covered in 24 spiritual adornments. That's how he recognized she is the one for him. The sages say this, but they also get it from Genesis 2:22. It says, Vayvie el ha'adam. He brought her to Adam. But if you take the first word and you count each letter, which has a numerical value, it comes out to 24. When Adam and Eve sinned, there's enmity placed between the man, the woman, and the serpent. And when God says, I will place enmity, that Hebrew word, if you calculate all the letters, comes out to 24. On the day of judgment, if you go to Isaiah 3, chapter 18, verse 3, chapter 3, verse 18 through 24, you count out 24 adornments that will be removed from those who have sinned against God. Another way to look at it is there are 24 priestly divisions in a year and 24 cycles of priests. So next slide, please. So I'm throwing a lot of information at you. Please bear with me. What does 24 signify? 24 signifies the original state of a human being before sin. Think about that. It also signifies the consequences of sin, being death. And it signifies the eternal priesthood that redeems and atones for sin. Next slide, please.
Why does it represent people before sin?
Because it represents Eve, who had the 24, who was brought to Adam. Keeping that in mind, we're going to go back to the broken Vav. And it says, I will give him my covenant of peace. When we look at the letter Vav, next slide, we notice that it is broken, and it is broken for a reason. If you go to Genesis chapter 1, and you look at the first sentence in the whole Bible, it says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. So go back one more slide. Go back one more slide, guys. You went forward. Yeah, see?
Yeah, I saw that. I just didn't see it on the next there.
This is in Pinchas, and that will be in verse 12. So next slide. So it says in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And one of the meanings of Vav is it is a connective letter. When it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth, the first time Vav appears in the whole Bible is Genesis 1:1, Ve'et. You have Hashemayim, which is heavens, Ve'et, and Ha'aretz, the earth. So when you have this covenant of peace given to Pinchas, you have Pinchas solving something. There's a broken vav. There's a broken connection from heaven and earth. Because when you go back to what happened in last week's Torah portion, the people sinned. What is the result of sin? The result of sin is death. What is death? Death is the disconnection from the life source to the recipient. Death is kind of a good thing in a way, and you all, before you throw the tomatoes, hear me out on this. When we sin, let me go back. When Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, why did God not make them eat of the tree of the life? Why was it a big deal that God did not let them eat of the tree of the life after they sinned? They would live forever, and so would their sin. Death is kind of the antidote for sin, in a way. Because when we sin and we live forever, that sin lives with us. Pinchas, what he does is he takes the spear and he sends it through the Midianite woman and the Midianite man, and 24,000 people of Simeon die. But when you look at the next verses, before I open this up for discussion, I did not have time to put this on my slides. There's something that is very interesting that comes up. When you look at the remnant that was saved by Pinchas stopping the plague, you look at how they're divided by their families. There's a Yod and a Hey, and every family name is in between a Yod and a Hey. And the rabbis talk about that, and they're like, this is the only place where it happens. And it is because each person has the name of God attached to their family. By giving this covenant of peace to a covenant of an eternal priesthood to someone who covered for the sins of the people, not just one time, but continually, God is, in effect, bringing this split vav back together. He is bringing the connection between heaven and earth back together. Because when we sin, that connection is broken. But when we are made complete again, which is the whole meaning of the word shalom, we think of it as peace. But really what it means is completeness. When it says, my covenant of peace, what he's saying, my covenant of completeness, a complete reconnection. And ultimately that points to Messiah, because Pinchas is a Messiah figure. Jesus said, Yeshua, when he was in the temple and the Pharisees kept hitting him with questions, he said something very interesting, and I don't know the exact verse, but he says that if you read the Torah, you would see it all prophesied about him. When we look at Pinchas, we see this is true. That you have a people that sin, a people who are faced with the consequences of that sin, a people who are covered, atoned for, and can go into the land as a people that are redeemed. As we move down a few verses to chapter 26 of Numbers, it's very interesting because you look at 26 verse 1, and I did not have this up on my slide, but it is split in between two verses. Let me go there real quick. And it's kind of important to consider this. Numbers 26 verse 1. It's not going to show up in the English Bible. And it was after the plague, paragraph ends. Yahweh spoke to Moses and to Eleazar the Kohen, saying, and you have a new paragraph right there. And the rabbis ask, why? Why is this verse split into two paragraphs? Here's the answer. Because the generation that was in the wilderness, that wandered 40 years, that was supposed to die off, that generation died right there with the plague at Baal Peor. that generation died right there. And the people were then able to go into the land. So with that said, I'm going to close it off, open it up for discussion, and we can hash it out. Give Stevie a microphone.
I might have lost track, but I'd like to go back like 14 slides.
14 slides?
I might have lost track because we're going back and forth.
I threw a lot of information out, I felt like.
Question, Stevie?
Which slide? I'm just going to hit through random ones. You tell me.
That's 14? Oh, no.
Tell me when to stop.
Yeah, that's it. That's the slide. There we go. Yeah. It's great. The Samek. Okay.
Yeah.
We got a lot of S sounds in Hebrew, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the distinctions that are made. For the Samek, and Samek in Hebrew means prop or support, right? And look at this. That's the point that's being made here, right? There's and also kind of what we're talking about is in the context of the word grace, chesed. And the chet means wall or fence.
Yeah.
The samek is prop or
Yeah.
support. And then the dalet is
The poor man.
door, right? It's door or gate. And so in an agricultural term, you have a fence with the gate propped open
Yeah.
so that you have the choice. You can stay within the pen where there is relative safety and perhaps food and nourishment, or you can go out where there's freedom and enjoy that. So there's the idea of grace there is giving us the freedom and a choice to do that, to come into the wall, into the security, or to experience the freedom. This idea of grace, but it's that prop, that samek, it holds it open.
Yeah.
It holds it open. So I thought that kind of connected as well, very well with the whole idea of this, even the broken vav as far as that goes as well, and the spear. So I just kind of wanted to run back and take a look at that because the
broken
samek,
vav?
representing compassion and resurrection, immediately made me think of grace.
Yeah. It's definitely tied to the prayer. So I was wrestling this whole week with two things to talk about. Because you can talk about how it points to Messiah Yeshua, or you can talk about how this Torah portion is really about spiritual warfare and what that represents. But I don't know where I was going with that. But anyway, I was looking at Somech Nophalim. And I was looking at Pinchas's name, is the important part. And how it sounds like it's supposed to be judgment. Like if you did not have the Hebrew manuscript in front of you, you could easily think that is a sin which represents judgment. That's the Hebrew letter sin.
Yeah.
But really it actually means the opposite, which means you are supported. If you die, you are held up and resurrected. Where I was going regarding the two topics I was debating on whether or not teaching this week. One of them on spiritual warfare, I would have talked about the Amidah prayers. And the second one is huge. If you want to go back and see what Daniel prayed 3 times a day, look at the Amidah prayers. Because it will open your eyes, and it's a totally messianic prayer. And it's as you're reading it, all these 18 prayers, you're like, how come the Orthodox Jewish community, which prays these prayers 3 times a day, doesn't get that their Messiah is Yeshua? Let me read briefly to you all that prayer of resurrection, and I'll just read it in the English. You are eternally mighty, Lord. You give life to the dead, and you have great power to save. He sustains the living with loving kindness. And with great compassion revives the dead. He supports the fallen. That's where someknophilim is. Heals the sick and sets the captives free, and keeps his faith with those who sleep in the dust. Who is like you, Master of might, and who can compare to you, O King, who brings life and death and makes salvation grow? When it says makes salvation grow, that word is Yeshua. And so you look at Pinchas, what he is. He's a warrior because he has a warrior mindset. And he is also a Messiah who fiercely defends his people. If you go back to the first slide, I'm going to go back to the first slide. Go back to the first one. There. And the reason I've had this, if you notice the small yud right there, so there are 4 textual oddities in the Hebrew in this Torah portion. There's so much here. And it's a big Torah portion too. But if you look at that yod, it is smaller than the rest. And if you look at the whole context of what happened at Baal Peor and how the people sinned and the 24,000 that died and the whole what Pinchas did, that yod symbolizes humility. And it talks about Messiah being humble, humbling himself. It also looks at what Pinchas did as a sign of humility because he was angry, but he was not arrogant. He was not personally angry, so when he went after the Midianite woman and the Israelite man, and he killed them in the tent, it wasn't like his personal rage. It was more like him doing that for the sake of the people. And you look at that, which is so important, and you look at how it ties to Messiah, and what ultimately, when you are reading the Torah, you need to keep the mindset in your mind. There are different layers to the layers of the onion. So on the surface, it's talking about a man named Pinchas who stops a plague. On a deeper level, it's talking about a man, the Son of God, named Yeshua, who stops a serious problem, which is sin. Yeah.
Wow. I have a question about Pinchas. If he is indeed grandson of Aaron and son of Eleazar, why was he not already a priest?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer.
Yeah. I'm not so sure I do either, but I've been reflecting on this because they give a lot of different rationales, and maybe Ted might actually have the answer to that.
What gave it away?
Sorry, not to interrupt, but the question needs to be risen: how old was Pinchas?
Yeah.
Because you had to be a certain age to be consecrated as a priest, and he could be old enough to be considered a man in Israel and able to serve in many aspects. But in order to be consecrated high priest, you have to be a certain age. If he was under that age, then he wouldn't necessarily be eligible to be consecrated as a high priest.
So to be a priest, you have to be 30 years old. But if you are 25 years old, you can kind of intern if you are from the priestly line. Or if you're a Levite to serve in the temple, you have to be 30 years old. But you can intern if you're 25 years old, to give you context. Ibn Ezra has an interesting comment. He goes with the idea that he already was a priest, but this covenant was an eternal one that the high priest, the Kohen Hagadolim, would come through Pinchas's line. So it's that the priesthood wouldn't depart from his line, that his descendants would be the rightful heirs for the priesthood.
I
Any more
did read,
questions?
some of them said that he had not, he had to be born after the priesthood was established in that lineage, which is a hard one to swallow. But that's because, why would that make a difference? Because Eleazar was not born before, was born after Aaron became a priest. So it's kind of tricky. There's something going on here that I think is more, there's more to it. And that's it. The part of it is, this is the eternal covenant that God is making and calling him to. And so I think that's the right track. But again, I don't have the full answer either. I like Ted's answer. That was pretty good too. All right.
I have a question for you or maybe somebody has an answer for. With what he was sharing, there is also, when you're talking about the Gematria of 2024, I was reading earlier about Ava, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, Avaha is love, which it takes 2, if you double that, Gematria, which is 13, is 26, which is Yod He Vav He. So in love, we have to share it with others. A sacrifice that we do for God, often we hunger for God, but actually he hungered for us first. So we sacrifice, or we kind of feed him by, it says prayer, etc. So the question was, when you brought up that at 24, I was curious why we were short 2, because like in other cases, like 7 is the perfect number, 6 is man, which is 1 less. Why is there a 2 number difference between 24 and Yod He Vav He?
I don't know.
Does anybody know? I just was curious. I was thinking about that. I was thinking about random questions, and I was thinking about that while we were having that discussion.
Guys, you know your homework.
Anybody know? Anybody know? All right.
No, honestly, no. That's a good question.
Just wondering, because, it was, and love, double it is 26, so anyway.
Yeah, someone else. We got a runner.
Easy.
So I have a question that, Stevie, you were talking about the pen and the open gate on that one slide, that the gate is open and our free will. Would that be also representative or symbolic of the narrow gate that Yeshua was talking about?
Yeah, I think we could draw a lot of inferences from that. It's just a matter of putting the Hebrew letters together, and that one, it is often the case that these words, the letters of the Hebrew words, it's not always the case. Wow. Sorry about that. It's not always the case, but it is often the case that the Hebrew letters that formulate the words, the root meanings of the letters, because each of the letters has a name.
Yeah.
So the root meaning of that letter contributes to the overall meaning of the whole word itself. And so that's a case like chesed, where you look at each of the element of those 3 letters, and also most Hebrew words have 3 letters. The root meaning has 3 letters. So not always, but most of them do. The majority of them do. So there's something to be said for that, how that unity, how God brings all of that together in a harmonious manner. And that's just one example of chesed, how it does that. So
Touching on what you said, so if you took it so you said it's like the wall and the supporting the door.
right.
Another way I would look at it is chesed is the first letter in chai, which is life. So chai supporting dalet, which can mean door or it can mean a poor person. And this life comes
Knowledge,
in.
right? The
And it
door is
supports the
also,
doll.
knowledge is also part of that. Yeah, it's at so
Yeah.
many levels, but we shouldn't be too surprised that that's the case because we serve an infinite, loving God.
Yeah. Anyone else? Over there, pass it over.
I thought I would just share this if nobody else wants to share something at this moment. I see a couple connections. In the gospel portion for this week is John 2, 13 through 22, and it's the time when Yeshua is purging the temple. And there's a verse that says, his disciples remembered the scripture reference, zeal for my house will consume him. And so that's one connection to the messianic action of Pinchas in what he did in the camp. But what was interesting, Stevie pointed out something regarding the wall and the gate. And as you're saying, there are so many different levels. One of them, as you were saying too, Lori, that a door, a gate opens and closes. And right now, it's open. And when you're talking about it's open where we have the freedom, and that reminded me of the prodigal son. He wanted his freedom, and many times when we think we want our freedom, it gets us into trouble. And visually, the stomach is enclosed, and if we can stay within the safe walls of our shepherd and his fold, I think we experience our true freedom, and whereas he's our shepherd and setting the proper boundaries. And another visual I had was there's a verse that says, seek the Lord while he may be found. And right now that gate is open. As the side door of the ark was open when Noah was getting ready. And there was a time it closed and those people were too late. And so I see a couple other connections that way with what you were pointing out there.
Well, to add what you said about Noah, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't even during the flood he hold the door closed? And so I thought the word, what did you say, hesed earlier, where he held the gate open. There he held the gate closed, like it was some sort of supernatural thing. Otherwise, they would have been flooded. And so to add to what you're saying, and keep in mind that he held it closed.
So one thing I just noticed is, so when you look at the temple grounds, and this will tie into, you look at the temple grounds and the way the temple was built, and they say the temple was built like a human body. So what happened at the temple, when you went to the temple to offer your sacrifices, which is kind of why the portion ends with sacrifices in number 28, 29. I like to use the word offerings instead of sacrifices. Is when you went to the temple, you saw how this all related to you as a human being and how these spiritual principles applied to your life. When you look at the physical temple, it says there's a sureg surrounding it, a choima, which is a wall. And this is in Ezekiel 40, verse 5. And it talks about this wall that surrounds it, the temple. And this wall can it be looked at as 6 cubits wide by 6 cubits tall, and it goes all around the sanctuary. Or it can be looked at as 1 rod wide by 1 rod tall. It can either be looked one of those ways, because 6 cubits equaled 1 rod, and the rod was the measuring instrument in that passage. But when it talks about the choima, the wall going around the sanctuary, it uses a samach to describe that word. Saviv is the word. It means it encircles, like a samach. And you look at why did they choose the measurement unit of 1/6, even though they're the same thing. It's to show us that the wall being 1 width, 1 high, refers to our relationship with God and others. Because our relationship with God is vertical. Our relationship with our fellow man is horizontal. To show us that we should be of one mind. That we are to be wholly committed in our zeal to love God with our whole heart, our whole soul, and our whole strength. And that we should be wholehearted in our zeal to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that is kind of what the meaning of that is. In preparing so that we are ready for when the door closes, that we have already gone through, but also that we accept the chesed, the grace that Messiah has. Because when that chesed comes, what is next? Once we receive the grace, how then shall we live? Is the question. That's something to think about. Any more questions? Are we good? We're good. So I'm going to close with a blessing. And I think it is, I say this every week, but I think this is very fitting for this week. And I'm not going to say the Hebrew. I'll just say the English. But it says, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has placed everlasting life in our midst." Amen.